So far in this series, we've taken a look at the Drakon, or dragon/giant snake enemies of the gods, and dangerous mythic animals that the Greeks thought stalked the unknown wilds of faraway places. But I hinted that snakes had a much broader role to play in ancient Greek religion. In fact, many of the gods themselves take the form of a giant snake, including a few that are pretty close to home and important for the regular home worship of most modern Hellenists. Let's talk about the two snaky epithets of Zeus and the ever-wonderful Agathos Daimon. Karate. If you have Hellenic polytheist household worship by Labris in your personal library, or if you frequented Hellenic spaces online, you're probably familiar with the epithet Zeus Ktesios and the mysterious Agathodaimon, or Agathos Daimon, that is said to give its blessing and guidance to the household when offered to on the day after Noumenia. If you don't know what Noumenia is, link is in the iCard to my video on the Attic worship calendar, where I get more into terminology related to sacred timing and worship practice. Zeus Ktesios, who clearly had syncretism with the epithet Zeus Meilichios, was honored in ancient times on Noumenia, and modern worshippers who practice the rites from Labris say a prayer to him on that day each lunar month. There are a few lesser-known epithets of Zeus that I'll mention briefly in the Ktesios section, but these are the main three topics I set out to dive into today. So what do we know about these snaky epithets of Zeus and the Agathos Daimon himself? That's what we're looking at. In part 1, we'll dive into Zeus Meilichios, who had a widespread cult around Attica, especially in the 4th century BCE onwards, and what sort of blessings he was said to confer, as well as how he was honored. In part 2, we'll take a look at Zeus Ktesios and what we know of the household rites performed to him around the protection of the household stores, vengeance or the restoration of goods after a robbery, and blessings on the family as a whole. And finally, we'll look into the Agathos Daimon, or should I say Agathodaimones, as the name referred to a few different concepts or entities depending on who was saying it and where. As always, sources are cited in the description below, including a really expensive monograph on Zeus from the scholar Cook that I picked up a few months ago for this project. If you'd like to help me afford these sorts of research materials and the monthly bills for the channel, consider checking out the links in the description to my Patreon, Ko-Fi, and Etsy, the latter of which I just put up a bunch of new hand-knitted goodies that I made myself, including hats, headbands, and fingerless mitts. No pressure as money is tight, though. We are all hurting this time of year after the holidays. With that out of the way, let's get into it. Part 1. Zeus Meilichios. Meilichios itself is an epithet with an interesting connotation to it. It translates directly as kindly and is often used to refer to speech. If you have seen the word translated before outside of its use as an epithet, it was likely the phrase with kind words or with gentle words. But it also had a darker side. Much like the term Eumenides or Semnai referring to the Erinyes or Furies as the kindly goddesses in the hopes of not saying their names would avoid attracting their fierce and usually unwanted vengeful attention, Meilichios was a title sometimes given over to gods who were known to have a wrathful disposition. It's shared with Dionysos, who, although he has strong associations with mental health treatment and PTSD recovery, as well as mirth and celebration from the gifts of wine, also once had a hubristic man torn apart and devoured by his own mother for denying his divinity, and afflicted all of Athens with crotch rot because someone made fun of his disco stick. See my video on the Dionysia for more on the latter myth. To see whether this is the case for this epithet or not, given Zeus also has the epithet Alastor, which refers to one seeking vengeance on behalf of another for crimes committed, we need to dive a bit deeper into the written and cult evidence we have for his worship. He was associated with Zeus Ktesios, the epithet we'll be covering in part 2 in later history, and they also shared similar iconography during the Hellenistic and Roman periods. Unlike Zeus Ktesios, under the epithet Meilichios, Zeus was primarily worshipped outside of the home, in sacred spaces specifically set aside for him, indicated by engraved stones and inscriptions in the bedrock of the surrounding area. After around the 3rd century BCE, we start hearing about temples and shrines set aside for Zeus Meilichios specifically, though prior to this, it does seem he was mostly worshipped in local temenoi, or sacred groves and gardens. We have a ton of votives that were dedicated to Zeus Meilichios surviving, and as we progress through the centuries, we find that he was portrayed in many different ways. Our earliest evidence from Pausanias refers to a seated humanoid statue of Zeus that must have been made between 460 and 410 BCE due to the artist referenced as having created it. Passing over a statue of Creugas, a boxer, and a trophy that was set up to celebrate the victory of the Corinthians, you come to a seated image of Zeus Meilichios made of white marble by Polykletos. Although the statue has long long been destroyed, there are coins that survive depicting it. In the image, he holds a fiale, or libation bowl, with a snake being invited to drink from it hovering just beyond view. Interestingly, Pausanias continues, telling us a bit about how this image came to be. I discovered that it was made for the following reason. Ever since the Lacedaemonians began to make war upon the Argives, there was no cessation of hostilities until Philip, son of Amintas, forced them to stay within the original boundaries of their territories. Before this, if the Lacedaemonians were not engaged in some business outside of the Peloponnesus, they were always trying to annex a piece of Argive territory, or if they were busy with a war beyond their borders, it was the turn of the Argives to retaliate. With the hatred of both sides at its height, the Argives resolved to maintain 1,000 picked men. The commander appointed over them was the Argive Breas. His general behavior toward the men of the people was violent, and a maiden who was being taken to the bridegroom he seized from those who were escorting her and ravished. When night came on, the girl waited until he was asleep and put out his eyes. Detected in the morning, she took refuge as a suppliant with the people. When they did not give her up to the 1,000 for punishment of both sides, took up arms. The people won the day, and their anger left none of their opponents alive. Subsequently, they had to recourse to purifications for setting kindred blood. Among other things, they dedicated an image of Zeus Meilichios. This nods a bit toward the wrath and appeasement necessary toward some deities who bear this epithet, but also other evidence we have of one of Zeus Meilichios' main roles when being worshipped, the ability to cleanse Agos from kinslayers. Link is in the description if you haven't seen my video on what Agos is. We have two different acts of violence being committed here that might invite anger. The act of injustice committed by the soldiers in assaulting the woman while occupying the city and moving to kill a suppliant after she had taken refuge, as well as the city dwellers who murdered the soldiers, who the term kinslayer invites us to think some were related to, and had to make atonement for spilling kindred blood. In my first video on human sacrifice, which is often intimately linked to kinslaying and cannibalism, link is in the iCard if you missed it, I also talked about some sacred laws at Selenos with specific instructions on purifying Agos if a repentant murderer who killed his kin in a fit of passion sought it out. The Selenos Tablet tells us that the rite would take place before the festival Kotitia and before the Olympiad. A particular household, or gene, is to sacrifice a sheep first to Zeus Eumenes and the Eumenides, then another to Zeus Meilichios in the plot of Myskos. Then they sacrifice to the impure Tritopatores, or the thrice-blessed ancestors, i.e. the offended dead and the victim, as they would the heroes, by pouring a libation of wine through the roof of their shrine and burning 1 part of 9 to them. Then the family should sacrifice a sheep to the purified Tritopatores, pour libations of honey mixed with barley meal, and set up a theoxania with meat and olive oil and honey and cakes baked for the gods. Burn them all after offering them, then anoint the cups and pour libations. Then to Zeus Meilichios, a ram would be sacrificed at the Temeos of Euthydemus, and if needed, the rite could be repeated the following year. It states that the portion of the feast for mortals should be consumed together at the site of the ritual and not be allowed to leave, as they can perform a sacrifice a year later at their homes. The sacrifice before and after to Zeus Meilichios in specific locations, especially given that the first is given alongside the aforementioned Furies, heavily implies that Zeus Meilichios has a hand in purifying the Agos incurred by kinslaying and pacifying the angry ancestors. The fact that the sacrifice is given whole at first and given alongside a more traditional feast at the site after further underscores this aspect at least. Meilichios may oftentimes be a chthonic epithet for Zeus specifically, meaning that at least the first round of sacrifices to this end would be polluting and undesirable to consume, which is why they're given whole. Remember that in Oranic or normal sacrifices, the bones and fat were burned to the gods, but in chthonic sacrifices, the whole animal was given, with no part for the people. See my video on offerings in the iCard for more on chthonic versus Oranic offerings. We see this again when Pausanias informs us that the Agathos of the Phytalidae had an altar of Zeus Meilichios near the river Ktesios, where ceremonies of purification were performed for exiled skinslayers to propitiate him. Plutarch also recited the same story in Theseus, though without the direct mention of Zeus. Across the Ktesios is an ancient altar of Zeus Meilichios. At this altar, Theseus obtained purifications at the hand of the descendants of Phytalus after killing brigands, including Sinis, who was rated to him through Pytheos. But purification wasn't the only reason he was called on after this epithet. Otherwise, we wouldn't have such a plethora of votive offerings. After all, I can't imagine kinslaying was so much more common in ancient times than it is now, media and myth notwithstanding. Some of the later images we have from the 5th and 6th centuries, alongside the Fiale mentioned before and a serpent coiling around the throne, further cementing the connection between Zeus and snakes in the concept of this epithet. A pair of bronze votive snakes carrying the inscription "I am sacred to the Meilichios at Pellana" were found at the Achaean Pellana, likely dated back to the 5th or 6th century BC also. After the 4th century BCE, we suddenly get a plethora of evidence for Zeus Meilichios as a snake himself. The most common votive relief image surviving from Athens depicts Zeus as a giant snake with a beard and a crest, with a number of grateful worshippers gazing up at him, though variations have been found on it depicting families of various compositions, implying that worship was done outside the home for this particular episode of Zeus. It was still a family affair. Oblong pillars have been found at the Trophonion in Lebedea, dating all the way back to 225 to 170 BCE, containing inscriptions dedicated to named individuals and Zeus Meilichios under slightly different variants. Zeus Meilichios, spelled the way that you see on screen, Daimon Meilichios, and Daimon Meilichios. Two of them carry the phallic structures similar to the Herms, with the fur down there and all, which implies a fertility element to that particular practice, though apart from snakes being, well, snaky, we don't have a ton of other connections to that kind of fertility surviving in our evidence, apart from a story we'll talk about in a bit from Alien. I suppose wealth generally in an agrarian culture implies fertility, as do snakes, though, as we've seen in Greek thought, the snake was far more complex than a mere phallic symbol or even just a villain. So we now know he was honor everywhere, but what for? The cornucopia was a symbol of wealth and abundance, which, as an aspect of Zeus Meilichios, is supported by a passage in Xenophon's Anabasis. We are told the story of when Xenophon sailed to Lampascus with an empty pockets, and was advised that because he hadn't sacrificed to Zeus Meilichios, he would be that way until he did. This is a little bit of a long passage, but bear with me. From there, they sailed across to Lampascus, where Xenophon was met by Euclides, the Phliasian seer, son of the Cleagoras who painted the mural paintings in the Lycaeum. Euclides congratulated Xenophon upon his safe return, and asked him how much gold he got. He replied, swearing to the truth of his statement, that he would not even have enough money to pay his traveling expenses on the way home unless he should sell his horse and what he had about his person. And Euclides would not believe him. But when the Lampascines sent gifts of hospitality to Xenophon and he was sacrificing to Apollon, he gave Euclides a place beside him, and when Euclides saw the vitals of the victim, he said he well believed that Xenophon had no money. But I am sure, he went on, that even if money should ever be about to come to you, some obstacle always appears, if nothing else your own self. In this, Xenophon agreed with him. Then Euclides said, yes, Zeus the Merciful is an obstacle in your way, and asked whether he had yet sacrificed to him. Just as home, he continued, where I was wont to offer the sacrifices for you and with whole victims. Xenophon replied that since he had not left home, he had not sacrificed to that god. Euclides accordingly advised him to sacrifice just as he used to, and said that it would be to his advantage. And the next day, upon coming to the Ophronium, Xenophon proceeded to sacrifice, offering whole victims of swine after the custom of his fathers, and he obtained favorable omens. In fact, on that very day, Bion and Nausiclades arrived with money to give the army, and were entertained by Xenophon, and they redeemed his horse, which he had sold at Lampascus for 50 dares. For they suspected that he had sold it for want of money. Since they heard that he was fond of the horse, they gave it back to him and would not accept from him the price of it. Here, we have direct cause and effect. He's told directly when offering to Apollon by his friend that Zeus Meilichios is unhappy as he hasn't been offered to since Xenophon got home, and tells him to offer to him as you would at home, which will alleviate his money troubles. It's interesting that the pigs we're told he gave were born whole, in the fashion of underworld deities. It makes sense given the association with wealth and the epithet, as the epithet Pluton of Hyades also was received with whole offerings. Again, agrarian concepts of wealth had a lot to do with the ground rather than the sky. The iconography of Zeus with the libation bowls is also found on hero reliefs from Laconia, further linking aspects of the epithet to the underworld and chthonic worship. Zeus Meilichios also had a specific Attic festival, the Diasia, held at Agre on the 23rd of Anthesterion, and we're told by surviving works from Aristophanes that it was a large and joyous affair for family and kin, which explains whole families on many of the votive reliefs. In The Clouds, Strepsiades mentions that he cooked haggis at the Diasia for his relatives relatives and bought a toy cart for his baby son, Pheidippides, at it. Both of the blessings Zeus Meilichios were said to offer were combined in the Macedonian tale of Pindus, which is preserved by Aelian in his Nature of Animals at 1048. In the story, Pindus sacrificed the first fruits of his hunting to a giant drakon, which continued to grow his prosperity as he built Cadiz with it, with his hunts growing more fruitful and his attractiveness to young ladies growing alongside it. His brothers got more and more jealous of the success until they couldn't take it anymore and unleashed their jealous wrath upon him, slaying him in cold blood. As this happened, the serpent rushed over to his body and crushed the three men to death, then guarded his body until his family could bury him. The river by which he is buried takes the name Pindus, which is why the story was told at all. This shows the wealth-giving aspects from earlier due to offerings and increasing prosperity, but also the purifying capacity, as Argos was considered purifying, and killing the brothers for kinslaying very much fits under Zeus's purview. As we'll see, this isn't the only wealth-granting epithet Zeus was honored for. Part 2. Zeus Ktesios and Zeus Meilichios. Ktesios, which translates to household or property, is both the name of a minor deity in the Hellenistic and Roman eras, said to be the son of Praxitike, whose name means justice served, and Soter, which means savior, and an epithet of both Zeus and Hermes as guardians of the household boundaries. Zeus Ktesios has many similar aspects to Zeus Meilichios, though without the chthonic implications. Worship of Zeus Ktesios was considered essential to the ancient Greek household, such that often friends and family from outside the direct household were invited to participate. We know this because Isaios, an Attic speechwriter who often discussed legal matters, pointed out that one man, Chiron, behaved strangely in relation to rites associated to sacrifice to him. And we always went with him to public spectacles and sat at his side, and we went to his house to keep all the festivals, and when he sacrificed to Zeus Ktesios, a festival which he attached special importance, to which he admitted neither slaves nor free men outside his own family, at which he personally performed all the rites, we participated in this celebration and laid our hands upon the victims, and placed our offerings side by side with his, and took part in all the other rites, and he prayed for our health and wealth as he naturally would, being our grandfather. This gives us insight into the domains Zeus Ktesios was said to rule over, again similar to Zeus Meilichios. But another departure from Meilichios is that clearly these rites were performed at home, and given that Isaios tells us that Chiron was particular about the rites and points out specifically that neither the household slaves nor other quote-unquote free men were allowed to participate, we can then infer that the norm would have been that the whole household, including the slaves, would participate normally. As per usual, I need to remind folks that I'm not endorsing slavery here, just acknowledging that it was practiced in ancient times, and that said practice did also affect the religious practice on a household level. That is the only reason we're talking about it. We see this sharing, minus the slavery element, in Antiphon's On the Mysteries, when Antiphon tells us about the mistress of Philonios and the dinner that they had after offering to Zeus Ktesios with her. Bear with me, this is another longer passage, but it gives us a surprising amount of detail as to what sort of offerings might be expected in an event like this. Later, Philonios happened to have a sacrifice to perform to Zeus Ktesios in Piraeus, where my father was on the point of leaving for Naxos. So Philonios thought that it would be an excellent idea to make one journey of it by seeing my father as far as Piraeus, offering the sacrifice, and entertaining his friend. Philonios' mistress accompanied him to attend the sacrifice. On reaching Piraeus, Philonios, of course, carried out the ceremony. When the sacrifice was over, the woman considered how to administer the draught. Should she give it before or after supper? Upon reflection, she decided that it would be better to give it afterwards, thereby carrying out the suggestion of this Clytemnestra here. Now, it would take too long for me to furnish, or for you to listen, to a detailed description of the meal, so I shall try to give you as brief an account as I can of the administration of the poison which followed. After supper was over, the two naturally sat about, pouring libations and sprinkling some frankincense to secure the favor of heaven, as the one was offering sacrifice to Zeus Ktesios and entertaining the other, and his companion was supping with a friend and on the point of going out to sea. But Philonios' mistress, who poured the wine for the libation while they offered their prayers, prayed never to be answered, gentlemen, poured in the poison with it. Thinking it a happy inspiration, she gave Philonios the larger draught. She imagined perhaps that if she gave him more, Philonios would love her all the more. For only when the mischief was done did she see that my stepmother had tricked her. She gave our father a smaller draught. Too bad he didn't give us a description of the meal, but the rest, minus the poisoning of course, gives us an idea of what modern offerings to Zeus Ktesios might look like. We have a sacrifice mentioned, likely of a bull or a swine for reasons we'll get to later, libations of wine and frankincense sprinkled on the fire. Remember from my video on offerings that the part of such sacrifices given in the Aaronic style would be the bones, especially the thighs, wrapped in the fat and tossed into the hearth fire for a home offering. Libations were a few drops of liquid poured either into the fire or onto the floor, and frankincense would be either burned in a small tripod or also sprinkled onto the hearth fire. Of course, the poisoning from the mistress poisoned this offering and prevented it from being answered, but it seems frankincense, baked goods in the shape of swine, and libations of wine would be acceptable home offerings for Zeus Ktesios, given that most of us just don't have swine lying around for such sacrifices. Earlier, we talked a bit about how the epithet Ktesios was called alongside Meilichios for purification from blood guilt, though this would have been done outside the home when it became necessary at specified shrines, and the main aspect called seemed to be Meilichios. However, these sorts of sacrifices weren't the only offerings received by Zeus in this aspect. We also have records in the Scholia of Aristophanes' Wealth and elsewhere that a specific kind of drinking jug, the two-handed kadiskos, was filled with what was termed ambrosia on each noumenia and kept in the larders to protect the pantry. These had lids that had tight sealed jars that would also be emptied on Deipnon, the night before the noumenia. And according to the Proglamana to the study of Greek religion, Antiquities described the consecration of these jars and their offerings thus. The lid must be put on a new kadiskos with two handles, and the handles crowned with white wool, and you must put into it whatever chance you have to find and pour in ambrosia. Ambrosia is pure water, olive oil, and all fruits. Pour in these. It is unclear from some of the documentation we have whether the god himself was said to be in the jar or represented by it, or if the jar was simply to hold offerings to him, which is more where I lean. Either way, it was clearly thought to protect the stores when offerings were renewed, and his worship was essential to the ancient Greek household's way of life. We have at least one depiction of him as a snake, and several more of him carrying the same cornucopia, horn of plenty, as Zeus Meilichios, hence why he's on this list of gods with snaky associations. He was also occasionally portrayed with Agathodaimon, who is frequently seen alongside the deity we'll be covering in the next section, the Agathos Daimon. I do need to give at least a brief mention to another major epithet, Zeus Philios, which received an explosion of popularity in votive reliefs offered in the 4th century BCE in Attica. His major province, overlapping with Ktesios but only in part, was the dining groups of friends who would visit each other's homes and feast together after offering to him. Several votive reliefs show Eranistai, or groups of friends who are members of what could be termed a dining club, alongside Zeus Philios at a banquet, and state directly that members of the dining group dedicated said relief to him. These reliefs often portrayed piglets approaching Zeus, showing that again pigs were offered as sacrifices to him. Like Zeus Ktesios, Zeus Philios is sometimes paired with Agathodaimon, similarly to the Agathodaimon. In a fragment of Diodorus of Sinope, we get the suggestion from a beggar that his art was invented by Zeus Philios, who, as a high god, will visit as a Xenos regardless of wealth and request a seat at the feasting table whenever a feast may be given. For more on Theoxenia and what Xenia is generally, see the link in my iCard to my video on Xenia. All of these epithets of Zeus give us a much more intimate picture of a god often seen as distant, one concerned with the preservation of wealth and the stability of the stores in individual homes, as well as the stability and prosperity of individual families and groups of friends. Sometimes I wish we had more sacred artists in the community to reproduce sealable, two-handed liquid-sealed kadiskos jars to keep in our pantries and larders as dedicated to the god. In the meantime, if you haven't before, consider dedicating one to Zeus Ktesios next noumenia. Part 3. The Agathos Daimon. The Agathos Daimon, or Agathodaimon, is a confusing figure, not in the least because he doesn't even appear to always be the same entity. Agathos means good or friendly. Daimon can mean a number of things, but often refers in earlier antiquity to a god you haven't identified that is interfering for good or ill in your life in some way, and in later antiquity to so-called spirits or lesser divinities, and on occasion to the spirits of some dead humans. Zeus is sometimes referred to as the Agathos Daimon alongside other epithets from earlier antiquity, but we don't get as much about the individual entity himself until the founding of Alexandria at the end of the 4th century BCE. In the text known as the Alexander Romance, we get the following account of the special role of the Agathodaimons were said to have played in the founding of Alexandria. Alright, third time's the charm, another longer passage, but bear with me. Now they began to construct Alexandria from the plain of Mesos, and the district took its name from the fact that the building of the city began there. When they were occupied there, as happens, a serpent appeared and terrified the workmen, who stopped working because of the arrival of the creature. This was reported to Alexander. He gave gave orders on the next day whenever it came down to capture it. So having received the order when the creature appeared next in what is called the stoa, they surrounded and killed it. Alexander then ordered that the spot should be a sacred enclosure and he buried the serpent in it. He ordered that the garland should be hung there in the memory of the Agathos Daimon, capital A and D, who they had seen. Next, he directed that the digging of the foundation should proceed only in one place, namely exactly where a great heel which is called the Copria. And when he had prepared the foundations of the greatest part of the city and planned it, he inscribed 5 letters: Alpha, Beta, Gamma, Delta, Eta. Alpha for Alexander, Beta for Basileus, which means king, Gamma for Genos, or son, Delta for Dios, of a god, and Eta for the initial of the phrase beginning Iktise, built the city. Now, many beasts of burden and mules were sacrificed, and when the Heron was consecrated, there came to the epistyle many troops of serpents, and creeping they made their way into the 4 houses already built. And Alexander, present in person, consecrated the city and the Heron itself on the 25th of the month Tibi. So the doorkeepers reverence these servants as Agathodaimones that had entered their homes. They do not shoot arrows at them, but even a pretense of shooting drives them away, and sacrifices were made to the hero as to the son of a serpent, and the animals were festooned with garlands, and given a rest from their labors because they had worked hard and long for the founding of the city. And Alexander commanded that the food be given to the guards of the buildings. They took the grain and ground it, and keeping off the wild creatures on the day quickly gave it to the dwellings in the buildings. So among the Alexandrias, even till now, this custom is preserved. On the 25th of Tibi, the animals are festooned with garlands, and sacrifices are made to the Agathodaimones by those who care for the buildings, and gifts of domestic animals are made. What's interesting is that this passage tells us there was both an Alexandrian city cult to a specific protective, capital A, Agathos Daimon, that was said to rule over the whole city, and individual house cults to home Agathodaimones, who were said to protect individual homes. We know that the civic cult dates back to somewhere between 320 and 300 BCE under Ptolemy Soter, and that the statues of Alexander in Alexandria had snake trappings. Under his leg, which was apparently supported by a tree trunk, a snake curled, which was said to be the city's civic Agathos Daimon. Later, the Agathos Daimon was said to receive his very own altar in one of the temples, complete with a massive statue of him and regular civic sacrifices. Interestingly, Daniel Ogden notes in his monograph, Drako, that the Latin word most associated with the Agathodaimones was genius, which also referred in later Platonism to the guardian spirits of individual people as opposed to households or cities. On the subject of the private house cults, which concerns us a bit more as modern worshippers, we do get more hints beyond the Alexander romance of what that might look like in a fragment of Philarchios, preserved in Alien's Nature of Animals. Philarchus, in his 12th book, gives us the following account of the asps of Egypt. He tells us that they were treated with great respect, and the result of this respect is that they became extremely gentle and tame. And so, being fed among the children, they do no harm, but creep out of their lairs when called and come to the spot. And the way to call them is to snap one's fingers. Then the Egyptians gave them presents in the way of friendship, for when they have finished their meal, they soak barley in wine and honey and place it off the table, off which they happen to have dined. Then they snap their fingers and summon the guests, so to call them. And the asps at a signal assemble, creeping out from different quarters, and they encircle the table, while the rest of their coils remain on the floor. They rear up their heads and lick the food. Gently and by degrees they take their fill of the barley and eat it up. And if some need causes the Egyptians to rise during the night, they again snap their fingers. This is the signal for the asp to make way for them and withdraw. So the snake realize the difference between this sound and the other and the reason for it, and promptly retire and disappear, creeping into their holes and lairs. Accordingly, the man who has gotten out of bed neither treads upon nor encounters any of them. Now granted, in the modern day, we know that snakes are obligate carnivores who likely didn't actually eat the food offered. But it's interesting to note that barley soaked in honey would actually attract the snake's preferred food if they were skulking about people's homes, mice and rats, who were much more of a bane to the existence of ancient people that had to deal with them. For folks interested in offering to the Agathos Daimon on the second day of the lunar month, said to be sacred to him in the traditional way, barley or other grains soaked in wine and honey seems to be the traditional offering. Though most modern people don't have house snakes like the ones you'd find in the Aegean in Egypt, so you probably shouldn't leave it out for too long and attract the unwanted guest that would have fed the actual snakes. According to a later writer in the 2nd century CE, alias Promotus, these snakes were real physical house snakes, sometimes venomous, with black backs and whitish bellies. They were sometimes venomous, and if one were bit, he instructs that they should wash out the wound with warm brine and apply a salve of unslaked lime and olive oil. Now, if you get bitten by a snake that you think is venomous, do not follow these instructions. Try and take a picture of the snake and head to your nearest hospital with and anti-venom. We have those now, and ancient remedies aren't necessary or even often effective for modern people. Do not attempt to feed wild snakes. If you want to keep a non-venomous snake in your household to honor the Agathodaimon, I guess that's fine as long as you do the proper research and have the proper equipment for reptile care, but don't try to attract a wild snake into your house and attract rats to feed it. That would just be silly and would likely result in damage to your home by the rats or the mice. That said, I hope you all enjoyed this foray into some of the snake gods of good luck and fortune for the household. If you're new here, feed the subscribe button to the Agathodaimon and send the like out to fetch the fleece of Zeus and atone for its crimes. Drop it down into the comments and let me know if you learned anything new about any of these entities, or even if you honor them with the monthly cycles of the moon. These are extremely domestic epithets and deities, so they very much apply for modern worshippers. Special thanks also to my patrons. You all have been clamoring for me to get to work finishing some of the series I started, and I finally got around to picking up the materials I needed to start this video in the past few months thanks to your support. Without you all, I wouldn't be able to afford the materials I need or have the time I currently do to spend on work like this. May the cycles of reciprocity between us ever remain positive. And remember, we're stronger together.